Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, everybody. This session is a part of the Bold Actions for Food as a Force for Good event, and it will focus on forces for financing food systems transformation and the finance lever for the Food System Summit that is going to take place somewhere next year in New York. Before we begin, let me on the first slide give you an overview of the format of our session today. We'll start, if I can have the next slide, Clarice. Yep, thank you. We start with a short 20-minute plenary. After some of my opening remarks, I'll hand over the floor to Wiebe Dreyer from Rabobank for a fire starter, followed by Nono Sekoto, the Managing Director and founder of Growth Youth. We will then move into 30 minutes of breakouts. You have, based on your registration, all been pre-allocated to one of the 5 breakouts focused on financing the 5 action tracks, because as you know, the action tracks are the key levers inside of the Food System Summit. Following this, we'll have 25 minutes to hear back from the breakouts, after which Jeremy Oppenheim, founder of Systemic, will give his reflections. And then finally, we will hear closing words from Erthrin Catherine, CEO and President of the Food Systems for the Future. So this is going to be an exciting event, preparing our minds for an even more exciting event next year, the first time the United Nations is organizing the Food Systems Summit. Through the supply chain disruptions that COVID has caused, we've all become more aware of the interlinked dependencies within our food system and how vulnerable it actually is to shocks. Many challenges remain. Just to mention a few, agriculture and land use changes is accountable for about 1/3 of human greenhouse gases, 2/3 of water uses, and one of the leading causes of biodiversity loss. On the other hand, diet-related illnesses such as diabetes and obesity challenge health systems, while 1 in 9 people worldwide still goes to bed hungry. In all these challenges, we believe that the private sector has a pivotal role to play to provide solutions. These solutions are important to deal with the challenges, but they also offer significant economic opportunities, up to $4.5 trillion by 2030. But it only will work if business works together with farmers, rural communities, and those involved all across the food supply chains to drive change. And that's why it's so important that the UN makes the Food System Summit a people summit and an action summit. Finance is increasingly recognized as a key lever of change for food system transformation. We're seeing this across WBCSD's food and nature work, and is exemplified by many of the companies and some of them in the room today. Financing for food system transformation offers a major investment opportunity. That could be accounted to $300 to $350 billion by 2030. We have to take a broader look at the need of the transformation of our financial system itself. Now, Reinventing Capitalism was recently published, can be found on the website, and no doubt somebody can put a link in the chat. Next to this, we see many ways that finance can be leveraged to catalyze change. Now, realizing and recognizing the critical importance of understanding the greenhouse gas emissions across banking, food and agriculture portfolios. Looking at the true value of food work stream to be able to better measure the value of financial, social, human and natural capital to the food system. And then in the Global Agribusiness Alliance, recently there was a platform launched for digital finance for agri-SMEs. So many things are happening. This session will inform the discussion of the finance lever of the Food System Summit, and I'm looking forward to our discussions today. And I would like to thank Rabobank for co-hosting this session, and thank all of the participants that have actually found the time to join us this afternoon. Before I hand over to the speakers this afternoon, Let me quickly go over some housekeeping rules. On slide 2, please. First, I ask all of the participants, unless you're speaking, to mute yourself. If you can, please change your name to have your full name and company so that we all know who will be speaking as and when you do. And then the takeaways of this session, including any slides that people use, will be shared with all of you at the end of it. Then always important when many people from different companies and sectors meet. On the next slide, please. The antitrust rules. So please avoid any discussions in your conversation or in chats that have to deal with pricing, cost, bid strategies, future capacity, customers, or output decisions to all keep us out of legal trouble. And that is the moment for me to hand over to Wiebe. Wiebe Dreyer is chairman of the Rabobank Managing Board and instrumental in developing the finance lever for the Food System Summits. Great to have you on the call. Wiebe, over to you. 7 minutes, please.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for your continued leadership in this domain. Also, thanks for the beautiful background picture that we have behind you. I think I can safely say that obviously finance is a critical lever to get the food transition going. I would like to talk a little bit about some thoughts as to how we can get that going. Why do we, or how do we finance the food system transformation that is so clearly on the central agenda of this conference? Can I be heard, by the way? Because in my screen it shows that Peter is still, okay, there you go. Thanks, Peter. Now, let me do a personal anecdote first before I start. I came from outside of the finance industry and stepped into it some 6 years ago with all sorts of notions of how finance really works and what it requires to be a force for good. I've discovered that it's important that we find a way to connect those two worlds for them to be effective. Now, let me talk to you a little bit about that before we start the conversation. One of the key thoughts that I would like to bring to you is this. It is important that the people from the finance universe, where there is currently abundant money available, and there's also a strong sense of purpose emerging from the finance sector to be part of the solution, it's critical to get those people and leaders involved in developing the solutions in the food transformation itself. This sounds somewhat abstract, but let me assure you that if, when the substantive solutions of a food transformation are being developed, that if a finance is part of that solution finding part, you will be given much faster access to solutions in financing. In order to do so, let me share with you a second thought. The second thought is this, that if we are transposing the world of food into the world of finance, there are 3 dimensions that need to connect in some way, shape, or form, and each of those dimensions requires solutions. And if you do, then this world of finance will be part of the solution of the food transformations. One element of that, one dimension of that is duration. Can you help the transitions that are required in the food system that will no doubt have periods that, or have a transition phase that has a longer lasting time than typically the world of finance is, the majority of the world of finance, the banking side, is capable of absorbing. So if we want to find a way of getting the whole spectrum of finance connected to the changes in food, we need to find a way of mapping the durations of these changes so that they can be financed in regular terms. This was true for example, the offshore wind conversion, where those windmills, they run for 15 years or 30 years, but a bank typically does 3 years. You can split the building, the transition phase, and the construction phase from the running phase, and then a bank can do its work and a pension fund can do its work. Duration is a critical dimension. The second dimension that needs to find its way to be absorbed in those transitions in food is risk. Typically, the transitions in food require, for example, farmers to change their ways. Typically, a farmer changing its practice requires about 3 to 4 years in which the farmer is exposed, is volatile, is at risk of a bad season. And if we want to make the farmer succeed and willing to take that risk, we need to find a way to de-risk precisely that phase mapping the risk profile of the transition so that it can be absorbed by the financial system is an important ingredient, and different members of the financing community can offer different solutions so that they together de-risk the transitions that typically have a risk profile that make it difficult. And finally, third dimension of finance is reward. And many of the changes that we talk about in the food system transformation have a financial benefit and a non-financial benefit. The benefits that a food transition has go far beyond economic returns. They affect health, they affect biodiversity, they affect chances of equal access to wealth and to wealth creation. They affect the balance between women and men in the job opportunity space. They affect all sorts of aspects, climate reduction. And most of those benefits are more difficult to quantify and more difficult to create as a reward in the financial terms. And Peter was talking about the new capitalism earlier in his introduction. There are actually early signs of this reward starting to materialize. And let me give you an example of this. Farmers are also a key player in the climate domain. Sustainable farming is a key lever in reducing CO2 emissions in the world. Also, farming can be a source of capture of CO2. If we can find an incentive for farmers to adopt those practices, we benefit the world at large, and that needs to be monetized so that where the reduction of CO2 is mostly needed in the industrial world, that can be translated into a transaction to farmers that change their ways. If we can inject that change of practice in monetary terms by rewarding the CO2 capture of farmers in their ways of working, that creates a new incentive to get the transition going. Those aspects, duration, risk, and reward in broader terms than strict financial returns of the entrepreneur that requires financing, are important to get this transition going. The only way to do this is to include finance in the early phase of the idea generation. And let me close with a thought or a hope, and let's imagine if we can see a world where food is converging to a more sustainable practice, where farmers make the shift, where people have more access, where the health patterns, the food consumption patterns shift. If we see that world for us, ahead of us, we need a global leadership network where the public domain, the private domain, the small and medium-sized enterprise, the farming, but also the big corporates are connected in a network of leaders that collectively have an agenda that see that route, but that can also relate the needed changes into dimensions that connects the finance world to the real economy world. I think that can be done, it can be possible, and you'll see more and more, and I hope we see that in the conference next year, that there is a big world of finance stepping up that wants to be part of the solution, and they can if they're part of the design phase early on. Thank you very much, Peter. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Wiebe, for these inspiring words. A global leadership network, that sounds really good. And I indeed echo what your hope is, that the Food System Summit will be the first of many meetings of that network. So thanks for that. I now would like to invite Nono Sekoto, Managing Director and founder of Growth Youth, and a National Executive Council member of the African Farmers Association of South Africa, to share your perspectives. Nono, I hope you're online.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Chairperson. I am completely, blown over by Wiebe's introduction. Thank you for this opportunity. And as a farmer myself, I'm very excited to be part of this discussion. What's interesting, just to also start with an interesting fact about me. So I started in financial services. So, I came from the finance sector, did 7 years, completely, understood it. So when I moved into agriculture, so it's been a decade now, and really trying to understand how do we make sure that this finance really works for us has been an interesting journey. The way Wiebe has explained it to us is so detailed in the way that at least now you kind of understand what it is I'm going to talk about, where I'm going to be reflecting on so many things that he shared. I mean, in the world that is really expected to sustain an increasing human population, for the next couple of years, we are seeing depletion and obviously limitations in resources. I mean, we know that water and land is scarce right now because of all the challenges. I mean, think about the one challenge we also have is unpredictable and it's coming and it's here. Climate change, we've just spoken about it as well. Now, regardless of all of that, all our food systems need to keep growing and they need to be successful to be able to sustain our livelihoods, you know, for the coming future. That is like it's so important right now, more than it ever has been. And to see this flourishing and successful food system, it really means that the current status quo really has to be transformed. I mean, we need to see, you know, as Wilbur mentioned, small scale and family farmers also contributing to such success. I mean, in my home country where I come from, South Africa, the division between large scale and small scale is glaringly obvious. And you know, if you can actually see how access and meaningful participation in the food system is just so polarized. And if we as a country fail to make sure that this integration happens, this will be very detrimental to our future food security. That is like not even a doubt. So we need to make sure that we're collaborating. And the kind of investments that is really needed to support, you know, well-integrated and inclusive food system, it really needs to be targeted and very appropriate. Wilbur really mentioned, I mean, those 3 points that he mentioned are really, really critical in the fact that you have to make sure that we're well integrated as small farmers and small scale farmers and advancing along the whole entire agricultural value chain. However, for such a food system to really, really succeed, you know, in the way I'm describing it, all players, you know, that's another thing that Wilbur mentioned, all players in this ecosystem have to collaborate at some level. And we all know that finance and investment are a really big part of making that happen. I mean, if you think about the phrase money talks, that is speaking the language of the world. We all understand what that means. And I think it's an opportunity for financiers, as Wilbur describes them, that they actually have the power to ensure that these decision makings actually happen, to ensure that there's proper inclusivity in food systems. In my experience, the big challenge isn't the fact that there's lack of funds. The fund is there, the funds are there, they're available. But access is the actual challenge. How do we make sure that we as small scale farmers and family farmers are accessing these funds? If you look at the makeup of the funds today, they really speak to the funders themselves. You know, their objective, what they're trying to get by, what they're trying to achieve. And that's why it's a little bit, you know, hard for us to be able to access it. It should be just as Wilbur said it, that you've got to include the farmers while you're building the systems themselves. The financial products need to actually be speaking to those who need the money most. And as a young farmer myself, in the last 10 years, having seen the industry and really understanding what it needs, it is glaringly obvious that for us to attain successful investments in the food sector, one of the elements that we also need to pay attention to is instruments of innovation such as digitalization. This can obviously give us, a way of collecting and interpreting the data on the ground so that financiers can feel comfortable as to what is actually happening and how to build the financial products that will really speak to those that need the money most. And I believe that's another place that financiers can really work on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona, for your inspiring words. And it's actually great to have the voice of a small farmer in this meeting, because that's going to be a crucial element of the success of the Food System Summit. We will now move into the breakout session. So Clarice, if you could put up the slide. We'll be having 5 breakout sessions. Each session has a leader. Each of the breakout sessions will discuss one of the action tracks. So AT on this slide are the action tracks that have been identified for the Food System Summit and will be the organizing framework for many of the conversations next year in the summit itself. These sessions will be run in parallel. You have been, as I mentioned, pre-allocated based on your registration preferences. The discussion leader will give a short introduction and then facilitate a conversation amongst you. You will have 30 minutes. There are 3 key questions. The first one is, what are the biggest finance needs you see for the various examples in the action tracks? What examples of innovative finance solutions exist in this place? And what opportunities do we see to develop between now and the Food System Summit to advance this agenda? Look forward to hearing the feedback from the sessions. 30 minutes, you'll be automatically coming back into the plenary room. So good luck to the discussion leaders and see you in 30 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I'm sure you were rudely thrown out of your breakout rooms and very inspiring conversations, but that's the rules of Zoom. What we're going to do now is feedback from each session. So the discussion leaders will have 2 minutes each to give us that feedback. So if I can start with action track 1, the right to safe food and healthy diets. Pieternel Bogaert, 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to summarize indeed, because a lot was discussed and mentioned. But to give answer to the question, where's the biggest financing need? We talked about the fact that you need both commercial finance as well as development finance for different needs, not just the private sector that needs finance, but also the context needs finance. The biggest need is most often in smallholders and early stage companies. Indeed, there's a lot of funds, but it's still difficult to access. Now, a couple of innovative solutions were suggested. One was to make it cheaper for sustainable companies than for non-sustainable companies finance. Also to see how you can scale smallholders or smaller groups into larger groups so that they become more eligible for finance. So to pool it effectively. In terms of opportunities, we didn't really discuss it, but that's something I would like to mention, also triggered because something that Bibi said was mentioned. Risk is a big issue, of course. But is it really a higher risk financing companies that focus on such a long term with the sustainable agenda in mind? And maybe that is something we have to work on, especially towards the summit, is the perception of risk. Should there be a difference between commercial bank and development banks? Shouldn't they merge and have the same agenda?
Great, thank you very much, Pieternel. Then let's move straight into action track 2, sustainable consumptions. Emmeline Vellis.
Thank you, Peter. So we had a lot of financial needs expressed, but also a lot of inspiring examples of what can be done. The way they put it, which I liked, was that we need both to redirect finance and investment into the specific business of everyone at the farm level, at the transformation level, at the consumer level. And there are many examples of what can be done. But also everybody needs to go beyond their usual sphere of action. And a good example of that was the fact that banks, for instance, of course, have a key role in playing in supporting the right businesses and stopping to incentivize the businesses that are not doing good practices. But they could also partner up and, for instance, work with food banks and others to really facilitate and boost up the use of technology and really transform the system the way it is today. We also had, in terms of needs, really the need to consider long-term results, internalize externalities, and we know this is the biggest difficulty to address at the moment. We have some momentum. There is a task force on climate-related financial disclosure, for instance, that we can use. And finally, we talked of really the need to increase traceability measurements across the food value chain and to be able to really reconnect producers and consumers and to communicate to consumers about why they should pay this price. What does it correspond to?
Did we lose Emmeline, or is she done talking?
She was done talking.
Yeah.
Done talking, great. That's a great signal. You stop talking, switch off the video, and keep the poor chairman swimming.
She's fast. She's fast.
All right, we go to action track 3. Gabi, If you give feedback, please.
Thank you, Peter. Then ours was nature positive production. Then a good discussion. We thought there was more time, in fact, then more to come for sure. 3 points, then relate to finance needs. We mentioned land tenure rights, that's very important. Blended financial, and of course, systemic approach that's absolutely necessary. In terms of examples, carbon market was one of the examples, what we need to work more. And then, of course, regenerative and biodiversity was mentioned, and Peter called the attention that this should be mentioned since the beginning, but it's a very good example about the ecosystem service. And opportunities. Some mention work together with farmers, partnership with public-private finance, technology availability, and capacity building. There is much more to work, and I believe also opportunity for us to work together offline and make it a little bit more actionable too. Thank you, Peter. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Then action track 4, talking about equitable livelihoods, Marianne Schoenmaker.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, we discussed equitable livelihoods and digitization of ecosystems. Blended finance was mentioned 4 times by the various pitches, as well as access to finance. The combination of return and impact was mentioned, and also the small ticket sizes that were sometimes the blocking factors in providing financing to farmers and farmers. A clear food systems framework is needed, and so that's a broad role for finance, not just for livelihoods. Access to finance for SMEs, including entrepreneurs such as young women. For public finance, it's an opportunity to reprioritize agri-finance. And so in view of the Food Systems Summit, there was a hope for a reallocation of public funds more towards food and agri-finance. It's a matter of partnership throughout the agribusiness value chain, where public and private partners should collaborate and work for find solutions and in the blended finance sphere. So all in all, nice introductions and initiatives, and we would have loved to have more time to further discuss. Over to you again, Peter.
Thank you very much. I'm jumping back to Emmeline. You had an additional point.
Yeah, I just typed it in the chat. We were asked as well, what are the biggest opportunities for us to really put forward this agenda? And several people in the room were talking of course, the pandemic, and nonetheless, all of the terrible effects that it has. It's really providing us with an opportunity to reshape the food value chains and the way we are operating. And so we should obviously try to use that momentum. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Then the last action track, number 5, resilience, Jennifer Blanke.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So we spent some time looking at really the particular issues that desperately need financing right now. Obviously things like risk preparedness and insurance, mobile payments, everything around data collection, in order to ensure that you have the information and that farmers have the information that then can become credit scores later on that can provide credit. So really critical area that needs more funding. Everything around digitization in general. Also funding staple crops, really hard, but very important quite often. And that's something that we need to work on a bit more. Also scaling up business models and SMEs that are more resilient, because again, we're talking about resilience. And one point that was raised is the fact that we might have been lucky this time with COVID, the fact that crops have still been performing quite well, and the fact that we might need to do a real good risk analysis across the value chains with worst case scenarios to know what might happen next time. One last thing maybe I would say is that across all of these financing areas, whether it's public or private, very important to ensure that there's some sort of theory of change so that you're looking at the sort of market failure that you're correcting, and that this isn't about pouring money in over a long time, but that rather it is catalytic. And particularly right now in terms of public funding, with all of the trillions that are going to bailing out economies around the world, just if some part of that might be allocated to resilient food systems, it would put us on a very good track going forward. Thank you. Peter, back to you.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you all for the disciplined feedback. Sounds like great conversations were had, never enough time. We're now joined by Jeremy Oppenheim. Great to see you, Jeremy. This is Forces for Food Systems Transformation, finance. What can finance actually do to be an enabler of food system transformations? We've had breakout sessions after introductory speeches of Wiebe and Nono, breakout sessions for each of the action tracks, and it gives me great pleasure to ask you to give any reflections that you may want to share. Thanks so much.
Peter, well, thank you, and thanks to everybody. And just listening to the feedback from the various breakout sessions and the clarity of the kind of insights that you offered was incredibly heartwarming, because in a way it sounded familiar, but on another hand, it sounded like it had some edge and specificity to the propositions, which was fantastic. Let me just pick out 5 themes that I heard from you all, and that I think sit at the heart of building food systems that can deliver on the both people, nature, and climate outcomes, and that we all want to see. And that the finance isn't just, if you will, a kind of derivative of the real economy. The way the finance system itself, I think, has the potential to influence a better real economy set of outcomes. And so there's a kind of very powerful feedback loop between the two. So let me just pick out 5 themes and that I think I heard you all say, but just hopefully give a kind of a frame to them. One is just the centrality of information, and the information that is being used to inform investment decisions today is not the right information, and it's lacks key aspects, as we all know, of what would be appropriate for good risk-adjusted and risk-calibrated investments, and those risks relate to aspects of the environment and nature and kind of supply chain type risks. But we've got to get working, and the finance sector, I think, can really help in sort of forcing and pushing hard to change the kind of information flows that can actually then drive better capital allocation and better results from the system as a whole. Second theme, and by the way, the information point, I think, relates as much to, the kind of the nutrition side and the health side as it does to the environmental side. Second theme is of course about long term and short term, and why is it that so much of the finance system in respect to food and ag is so short term, right? And what are the ways in which private actors as well as public actors can help change the duration of investment in the sector? And how do we get to both the longer term offtake agreements and the forms of, if you will, capital mobilization that can actually shift to allowing farmers in particular to take longer term risks in ways that can actually deliver on the outcomes that we want to see. So I think there are different examples of shifting to the long term, but this is a sector where it's so critical, right, to the overall outcomes that we want to see. Third is, of course, the territory of shifting the use of public capital, and many of you have heard me on this before and others on this before, but we do have $700 billion of subsidies that go into and support mechanisms that go into the system, and at best, you can find 15 or 20% of it where you have public money supporting public goods. So there's 80% of it which isn't doing that. So there is a question of how we take some proportion of that and really direct it towards delivering the outcomes that we all want to see. And that takes me to point 4, which is the reference that a number of you made to blended finance. And the blended finance models can sometimes be seen as a way of kind of overcoming a multitude of sins, and they really aren't that. They have to be in the context of catalyzing the real shift in market conduct and in technologies and in kind of policies that we need for the system to work properly. But if we could redeploy some of that, public capital that is today not well directed, and use it to then crowd in private capital with right forms of risk sharing across parties, that there is across all 5 action tracks, every single one of them, huge opportunity. And then very last point is just around, the obvious challenge that, one would think digital technologies and smart business models could help us with, and that is the classic finance challenge of aggregation, right? That is what finance does, right? It does a number of things, and it does maturity conversion, but it definitely does aggregation, which allows more risk to be taken, right? And driving down cost of provision of finance, in particular to the smallholder sector. And while it may well be the case that over the decades to come, not all smallholders will survive, right? That is a hard but nonetheless probably accurate statement. But what we're doing today in terms of finding transaction aggregation mechanisms that can really drive down appropriately the costs to financing, those smallholders that can actually, with the benefit of the land tenure that was mentioned earlier and the like, be long-term viable and long-term thriving, right? We've got to get those kind of new technologies around aggregation and scale and the use of digital to come together. So 5 themes, they fit together. They're not separate themes, right? I hope that you all know that, around getting the right information to inform investment and capital allocation, the maturity transformation and shifting to the long term, appropriate deployment of public capital, using it to crowd in private capital through blended finance, and then using technology to drive aggregation. I mean, there is a toolkit available in the finance space, and I'm really excited about what we can do together.
Great, thanks so much, Jeremy. Always impressive to hear you summarize a global conversation in 5 points that we can all remember. Thanks for that. So thank you all to all the speakers. Please stay involved in this important conversation around how we can turn finance into a lever for food system transformation. But before we all hang up, the last 5 minutes, I would like some closing remarks from Earthrin Kassin, former head of the World Food Programme, but now the founder of Food Systems for the Future, which is about the best possible title you can give any initiative. So Earthrin, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. It's been quite a pleasure being involved in today's conversation, hearing from you and from Viva about the what is possible. Because the reality is, good intentions and grand plans alone will not create the world we want or the food system we need. Without adequate financing, particularly investment in resilient, sustainable market actors across the food chain, terms like build back better or building food systems that deliver are merely another set of catchy slogans. Financing underpins the success of each and every action track as we look forward to this summit.
The importance of the food systems and the outcomes of the Food Systems Summit as a shared commitment to a way forward required to deliver the changes necessary across all 5 action tracks. The importance of this work was unbared by COVID-19. Yes, it's right. Our food system, the long food chains that we saw disrupted in the high food price crisis of 2009 didn't happen this time. But what happened? The problems arose when curfews created lost produce because of lack of refrigerated trucks, lack of storage. When lack of refrigerated storage at markets increased waste and losses when market hours were reduced. When lockdowns and shelters in place resulted in income loss, with few social safety nets to support business continuity, marketers, and necessary food distributions to affected populations. And all of the systems fell far short of meeting the economic needs as well as the food security needs, particularly of the most vulnerable. The why behind the lack of investment in these types of activities in the agri-food sector to date has been long recognized. And Viva talked about this in his opening remarks. The financing challenges that have always been exacerbated in the food and agriculture sector due to long, highly volatile financial returns, high startup costs, and oftentimes the difficulties of evaluating the riskiness of agriculture and food system. And unlike many other growth sectors, food and agriculture enterprises require oftentimes large capital infrastructure up front. And even if a promising model, entrepreneurs resources.
Earthrin, you may have to switch off your video because the sound is cutting off if you can't switch off the video.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay. I was saying that we know that they're higher risk in the agri-food sectors. That's been part of the challenge that we've discussed for quite some time. But I'm delighted to participate and to close out today's important conversation on financing. Delighted because today's discussion included not just the right words, but the right actors necessary to address these long-held assumptions and the right actors to make a difference. DSM, FMO, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and of course, Rabobank. As leaders in agriculture and finance, leveraging your market positions to bring other investment actors to deliver the change needed to make the difference for the communities of interest. But none of you alone, not even Rabobank alone, will deliver the capital sufficient to address every monetary investment need. Government investment in infrastructure, VC and equity capital to meet the startup and growth financial needs of small and mid-sized market actors, as we've talked about here today, as well as the much discussed but rarely deployed in the agriculture sector, sovereign wealth, and other presently sidelined capital asset owners must all be lured to the table of agri-food financing, not for charitable or philanthropic or any other feel-good reasons alone, but because of the financial opportunity the agriculture and food space can return when capital is appropriately deployed. The return on investment for the patient investor is real. The reality exists when supported by the government policies, creating the stability business operations require, particularly the growth required to deliver return. This reality exists when women are empowered not just through cultural norms, but through the necessary government action to ensure women's equal access to capital, as well as their ability to control the capital that they access. The reality exists when youth are included in the capital access equation, providing opportunities for the breakthrough innovations and energized productivity. New market youth actors will deliver to the food and agriculture space. The 5 action tracks represent the right discussion priorities for delivering upon our shared commitment. And finance is the cross-cutting issue. We must avoid admiring and elevating the problem of capital access into the mythical Gordian's knot. Adequate blend financing must become the sword to cut through the Gordian's knot.
You're cutting out again, maybe the video off. All right. I'm not sure if you're still here. I think you dropped off my screen, but. All right, well, that's one way to end this speech, I guess. We are at the end. You're still here, but I can't hear you, Earthring. I think the internet has frozen up at your end. So we have passed the 5:30 Central European time. So I think this was the scheduled end time of our meeting. I really thank everybody for making the time to join. I thank all the speakers for joining, and please stay in touch with this important lever for the food system transformation. We'll make sure that you'll get the slides, the key takeaways from this session, and we'll keep you all informed about the next steps in the run-up to the Food System Summit. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe.